I feel like if I did that, people would be less pissed off if they knew I had the condition. Because they'd be like, oh, it's fine. But they have a pet. What do you mean by travel? Like outside the country?
We grabbed this.
No.
Oh, wait, what did you just say?
Because there's something.
Wait, hold on. Let's run that back one more time.
Wait, no, I didn't say anything.
If they could come up with
Okay, that's right.
a way to help.
Yeah, no.
I would genuinely, I'd have to kill about 5 people for that to get a key. Probably more if it was secure for everyone.
I'm glad we're chatting because we're going to start off today with a discussion. So I had you do the scientific literacy number 4. And I'm actually going to start off the slideshow with just a quick intro video here.
Many people might have heard of people saying that MMR vaccine might cause autism, and it's just not true. The original study that suggested that was totally debunked and actually retracted by the journal that published it. And we've had several studies involving millions of children, several different studies. There is no scientific evidence that MMR vaccine causes autism, and other vaccines have been studied too. I mean, the simple truth is vaccines do not cause autism.
All right, so you read some papers about this study that he mentioned with Andrew Wakefield, and then some papers published after it was retracted. Right? So I want to spend the first 10 minutes of class with just a discussion on what you learned, right? Thinking about the paper itself, why was it fraudulent, who funded Wakefield, what are some problems with this paper. And then I want you to do some real-time application of your critical thinking skills in scientific literacy. I want you to navigate to the CDC website and answer a couple more questions. So go ahead and talk amongst yourself for the next 10 minutes.
I did this like a week and a half ago, so I don't remember a lot of it.
But, well, we're here to tell you when.
No, I remember that the Wakefield study was fraudulent because they were artificially, the data didn't fucking
Well, and also at
least what you were
and
the age range. Yes. The age range was huge. The time range between the vaccine and the onset of symptoms was huge. The time range also aligned with the onset of symptoms in autism, so that's just how fucked up. He funded the Wakefield study. It was like an organization that was like vaccines bad.
well, we have all talked about that.
Well, there was a big group that was against vaccines, and there was an individual doctor who funded it.
Yes. I'm lying, I don't know. I just
The CDC's official stance is that claim vaccines do not cause autism. Evidence-based claim. It's not an evidence-based claim because studies have not ruled out the possibility that infant vaccines cause autism. You know what I think it causes? A lower infant mortality rate. So I think maybe vaccines. So I think maybe it's a worthy sacrifice. Have been ignored. Can I be so fucking for real? If our infant mortality rate has gone down as much as it has because of vaccines, if the infant mortality rate has gone down so drastically because of vaccines, it's fucking worth having everyone autism even if it does. I'm sorry, fuck off. Whose room are you in? Is there any proof that it does?
They say that those studies
Okay. Well, there's no. Sorry, if you're an anti-vaxxer, would you rather you have autism? Would you rather I go to your baby, cough on it, and it croaks? If I I'm confident your small infant child is going to die. Even if it does cause autism, I think it's a worthy sacrifice.
If you are the anti-vaxxer that's not doing any non-GMO, like you're making their own flour, you're living on a farm, fine. You're not talking to people.
Anti-vaxxers have been vaccinated.
But if you're living like a normal life, it seems a little much.
Anti-vaxxers almost always have been vaccinated, and they just choose not to vaccinate their kids. It's like, you are fine with the vaccine.
Clearly not. I was getting the heated debates for this decision.
Dude, I knew someone whose parents were doctors and like paralyzed.
Yes.
I'm not best friends with nurses.
Like I walked out of there, I was like,
But for nurses,
Vaccinated your daughter.
Yeah.
My aunt is a nurse and I think
no, I thought we were too bad.
sorry.
in hospice or something?
She worked at a nursing home, and you know, when she was working there, the death rate went up a lot, and then when she left, it went down. So,
Okay, so it says, what did we learn?
So he's a liar.
Well, is he a liar?
it just killed the people.
Somebody lied about something. What? CDC was
How cool is it? Oh, I
HHS is providing appropriate funding and support for vaccines and not
How morally wrong would it be?
I don't even know what's
We're doing it again.
How's the CDC website looking?
Sad. Vaccine apparently potentially cause autism.
How many hits?
So we're just like,
The guy yeah, how many hits? It's about to be at least one. So I'm not gonna write this. Allegedly.
Walk with me here.
Hey, I think okay, and you are anti-vax because of autism should watch your
well, that's the thing. It's not a death sentence.
No, it's not. My sister has autism.
Well,
Who's the medical professional?
My first term used to go to, so I don't have to go anywhere. Second term,
Oh, really? Really, we're back to normal.
yeah, see, why are we looking at your
Guys, I think if you're really this worried about your child, can you just like help them?
Well, this is the thing. The same people that are worried about this are not, like, you're not helicopter parents. And before this,
Your kid is on that.
like, your kid could be failing algebra, but you're more concerned that they're not gonna get their vaccine. I was doing this, and then I didn't know.
Can we just kill people? Clearly. Or is that like, does that communist? I don't care.
We had a report about CDC.
Okay. However, I don't think that's what communism is. You know what communism is.
And then you live
Holy shit. You're able to aluminum foil? You put it on your food.
Which means that there's aluminum export by the age of 18.
I don't fucking care.
Oh, that causes asthma. What's that?
God forbid I have aluminum in my system. You have microplastics in your system,
I have
Susan.
asthma. Do you have asthma because of these vaccines, according to the CDC?
Probably, your lungs collapse because of your
I'm fully vaccinated. I don't have asthma.
I'm not that. I need to go get my flu and go.
Oh, I have
Last time I got a vaccine, also my back was violently twitching for about 5 hours. Yeah, we almost had to report it. I would have become another one of those people that used to support this.
Oh, the next topic's painting. Oh, I love painting.
Could we
Never
kill?
No.
No.
RF?
No. There's a lot of other people who should kill me.
I feel like the worst
Our
part
kid will probably be out.
Good. He's gonna die soon. They took out the worm allegedly. I think there's a lot of worm. How many people in Denver have been with bugs?
7%.
So how many of them have chronic traumatic encephalopathy?
Of the
CT? Yeah.
Probably 60.
So, okay. So, there's Okay, I'm just gonna say it's at least one person in the government is CTE, and that's. You ever meet someone with CTE? Awesome.
All right, so let's talk about scientific literacy. If you are not scientifically literate, what might
Our last question, CDC website. How could the lack of scientific literacy influence parents who visit the CDC's website?
you don't have those medical consequences?
They're not gonna vaccinate their kids, and then their kids are gonna die at 2 months old.
They're saying that they're infants, they may or may not gain used to
Like there's a lot of people that did that. Like I know people now that still like believe to their heart of hearts that that's like a true fact.
Yeah, the people that are anti-vaxxers, are they going to the CDC
I don't
website?
They're
know.
going to the
I just
CDC
don't really know.
website to confirm
I'm
what they
not
already
the most
think.
scientifically literate.
Yeah, my dad.
No one's going to the CDC website to be like, let me get my own opinion.
Because I feel like anti-vaxxers already are not trusting the topic.
Exactly.
And
They trust our
But also,
information.
sometimes I don't want to trust the government website, which is something.
I don't trust the government ever. I come up with my own opinions because I'm not a stupid idiot.
This is what I'm saying. See, how do you
And I feel like no one actually goes away like, my dad never does research, but it's just like,
no, not
Well, you can never conclusively say
So
something.
like as a parent, you know, went to the CDC.
Yeah, you can't conclusively say that I'm not going to spontaneously explode in 2 seconds.
You might. These parents were
Exactly.
way like assured that they should get those vaccines.
Yeah. 30 seconds.
Please let's get through the discussion.
I mean, you can't conclusively say that for the first time ever there's going to be a huge earthquake in Minnesota that like levels the country.
My daughter's best friend.
Minnesota, the Howard level.
Parents were very against it. And
It's
they
really,
lost
really
especially with the same one. His
You
sister
ever
got
lived
it
through an
in the
earthquake?
room, and they're like, all right, now you're your turn. And you know, it's like, okay, we could have avoided this
I
entire.
lived through a 6.0 earthquake.
But at the same time, I mean, you're a parent.
10 out of 10 would recommend. I went to church that week
And that's what you believe.
and the youth leader told us about kids dying in the earthquake, which I thought was a little weird because we were like 8. Thanks, Vicky. You were normally really good at your job. I don't know why you decided to be rude.
Always messing it up.
How they do when they're.
No, that was a one-time.
okay, so it's saying, it's listening to me.
Yeah, but that's because we're testing for it.
Yeah, clearly.
That's because we
It
just.
just so has the vaccines and infants.
All right,
Can I be
this is a
so
hot
real?
topic, and a lot of
We
times,
didn't
my
know this was
classes
existed for a
are very
long
heated debates over these topics. Especially this topic because it's really at the forefront of the news lately. Let's think about that Wakefield paper, right? When you read that Wakefield paper, were there any things that stood out to you as being a red flag?
The small sample size.
Yeah, really small sample size, right? And we've been learning this in lab all semester. The larger the sample size, the better data that you're going to get. And they used, 12 children? And they used the evidence they had on these 12 children to apply it to millions of children. So very small sample size. What else?
The sample was curated, like it wasn't a random selection, they specifically chose these 12.
Yeah, very curated selection. I think some of them came from his own lawyer's clients. There were connections.
There were liens in the case against the companies.
Yeah.
And also there's like obvious medical violations and overly invasive procedures performed that were not necessary for the treatment of those children.
Yes. Yes, some huge ethical red flag should be raised here. I mean, these are children. These were young children. And they were going through these very invasive procedures that they didn't need. Right? That's traumatizing. That's really not a great thing to do. So these ethical violations, plus he had connections to lawyers that wanted to sue vaccine companies, right? So there's a huge personal motive for him to come up with the proper conclusion according to his lawyers. So let's see, we talked about who funded the Wakefield study. Okay, you visited the CDC website. What is the CDC, what is their official stance on vaccines and autism? Yeah?
basically they don't have enough evidence to prove they don't justify.
Yeah, they're saying that we don't have enough evidence to prove that vaccines do not cause autism. They're basically leaving the door open, saying that vaccines could cause autism. All right, what types of evidence do they use to support their claims? Yeah.
Parental statements.
Yeah, parental statements. I think they even include like a survey of some of the parents in that. What else?
There's been a rise in autism cases since the 1980s, which correlates with the rise of vaccines given to infants.
Yeah, yeah. So they see that correlation. Now, is correlation, does that equal causation? Oh, we have learned that in our scientific literacy. So there might be a correlation, and it might be that at the same time that vaccines were being developed, autism diagnoses were being more common. More, right? What other evidence? Did anyone click on any of like the hyperlinks that they put in their text? I think some of those hyperlinks, you click on them, they actually lead to legit scientific research, right? But the research that they're linking to, again, is research saying that we've done these studies. We don't see a link to between vaccines and autism. So they're just linking these studies that are basically proving the point that vaccines do not cause autism, but they're saying there's a lack of evidence still. Right? It's kind of like saying how we cannot definitively prove that Bigfoot does not exist. We have a lack of evidence that says Bigfoot does not exist. Right? So theoretically, Bigfoot could still exist. Right? And if you think about it, that's the whole basis of science. Science cannot prove, but rather accumulate evidence for or against an idea over time. Anyone have any final thoughts on this? So if you were a parent going to the CDC website, trying to figure out if you should vaccinate your child, what might you walk away with? Like how might your view change or not change after reading the CDC website? Would you vaccinate your children? Maybe yes.
Because an inkling of doubt can always change something.
Yeah. This is planting an inkling of doubt, right? This is your child you're talking about. You're probably very protective of your child. There's nothing, you don't want anything bad to happen of them. And then you read this website that says, well, maybe vaccines do cause autism. That's planting an inkling of doubt. You might walk away and choose not to vaccinate. What would be the ramifications for society then? Yeah, infant mortality rate could increase. Those diseases we're vaccinating against can become more prominent. I mean, we're seeing this a little bit, like whooping cough used to be completely eradicated, and now that children are not being vaccinated as much against whooping cough, we're seeing it start to reappear in our population. So, real world ramifications here. All right, I thought we should end our discussion by watching another short video as to what do we currently think causes autism, right? What does the current research say?
What causes autism? Research has identified many risk factors, both genetic and environmental, that can play a role in developing autism spectrum disorder. Although no single cause has yet to be identified, genetics research has identified many genes associated with autism, and environmental factors that can increase the risk of developing autism include maternal fetal infection, certain medications taken during pregnancy, including antibiotics, advanced maternal age, pregnancies going beyond 42 weeks, exposure to air pollutants during pregnancy, significant premature birth and low birth weight, preeclampsia or toxemia, fetal distress, and finally fetal hypoxia. It should be emphasized, though, that autism evolves during fetal development, not after birth.
All right, so basically he's saying that We think we might have found some of the causes, but it's an ongoing area of research. But definitely everything so far is pointing to autism happening before the child is born, rather than any influences afterwards, such as vaccines. Yeah. All right, any questions? We're about to have a huge shift in topic here. All right, we're gonna dive back into content now. So Tuesday, we talked about evolution and natural selection, right? We talked about how the modern definition is the change in the allele frequency in a population over time, right? So we're talking about the phenotypes being acted upon, right? And the underlying genotypes thereby being affected. Okay? And we provided a lot of evidence, right? Evidence that this is occurring, right? Paleontology, convergent evolution, different homologies. And then we looked at one of the mechanisms by which evolution can occur. We started talking about natural selection, right? And so there's more than just natural selection at play that can cause populations to evolve. There are these other mechanisms that we will get to today, right? Such as genetic drift and gene flow and mutations. But we're going to stick with natural selection a little bit longer, right? Because natural selection is a big one. It's been highly studied. There's a lot of information on it. So to remind yourself, right, we talked about natural selection. 4 criteria have to be present in a population in order for natural selection to occur, right? Overpopulation, there must be variation, that variation must be hereditary, and there must be fitness differences associated with that variation. So essentially what it all boils down to is there's differential survival and reproduction, meaning some individuals are going to survive and reproduce more than other individuals, right? Based on the traits that the environment is acting upon, right? So we've gone over this. We know our 4 criteria. Hopefully you can apply the 4 criteria to any scenario. But I really want to emphasize, right? Natural selection is the environment doing the selecting. And the environment is doing the selecting in many different ways, right? So this could be predation, right? The selecting pressure in the environment is the predators, right? Maybe in this instance, some butterflies are easier to see, or I think those are moths actually. Some moths are easier to see for the predators than others. So maybe the lighter colored moths, in this case, are going to be predated upon more often than the darker colored moths, right? So it's the predators in the environment acting upon this phenotype that is shown. It might be disease, right? So this is the Tasmanian devil. Their population is currently being decimated by a disease. The disease is in the environment. It's acting upon these individuals, right? The environment is doing the selecting in this case. Could be competition, right? Competition for a variety of things, right? Competition for mates, competition for territory, for nesting sites, competition for food, right? The competition is part of the environment doing the selecting, right? Maybe there's only a certain amount of food, so you have to compete and be the one that wins in order to have access to that food. Same with mating, right? You have to compete for your mate, and if you lose out, you're not going to mate, you're not going to have your offspring being produced, right? You're going to have lower fitness. And food resources is a big one, right? So food resources, there can be competition over, right? But it could just simply be whether or not there is food available, right? In a certain environment, there's only a certain number of food, right? A certain amount of food, I should say. And those that are better able to exploit those areas for the food are going to be the ones that survive, that exist, right? So again, environment is doing the selecting. All right, couple of things I want to emphasize with natural selection. We talked about natural selection not having a goal. right? These organisms are not going through natural selection with an outcome in mind, right? It's just what happens naturally because of their environment, right? So selection can only exist upon, or selection can only act upon existing variation, right? So if there was a selection pressure against purple-furred bunnies, right? Great, but we don't have purple-furred bunnies, right? So that is not going to happen because that variation does not exist. It's often constrained by an organism's historical evolution, right? So if an organism evolved to live a certain lifestyle, right? Maybe it evolved to swim in the ocean, right? It's going to be the traits that allow it to live in the ocean that evolution is going to act upon, right? It can't act upon traits that allow it to live on land, because again, those don't exist for that particular organism. And oftentimes, what happens during evolution is we get these adaptations to the environment that might be compromises, right? So for example, I have my cartoon of this beaver up here. It's going to greatly help the beaver to cut down trees if it had chainsaws for hands, right? But the compromise there is if you have a chainsaw for a hand, you're not going to be good at doing other things, right? It's going to be hard to grasp or eat, right? So there are compromises made. The birds of prey that we have talked about a little bit here, in order to attract a mate, some of these birds might have really brightly colored feathers. You can see this brightly colored plumage here, and they might do like an elaborate dance with that plumage, right? That's really great at attracting a potential mate, but maybe it's also really good at attracting a predator, right? Showing off to a predator. So there are those compromises that have to be made, right? And finally, like I said, there's no goal. There is changes happen unpredictably, right? We can't predict what's going to happen, right? They happen unpredictably. The environment is doing the selecting. It could be by chance, right? These happen very unpredictably in nature, and when they happen, and if they're beneficial, great. Maybe they're not beneficial, and that trait might die off. All right, so we're not aiming to make perfect organisms. All right, I want us to do a class review, kind of a fun activity here. So maybe you've been to this website before, but I want you to simulate natural selection happening and seeing how the environment is acting upon certain traits. So I want you to go to that website. I want you to look at this rabbit population and add in a mate so we can start making offspring. And then I want you to add the fur mutation, and then I want you to add wolves. And I want you to watch what happens, right? How does fur color influence the survival? And what if we change the environment? Right? What if there was a snowy environment instead? And I'll kind of run this up on the screen alongside you all as well. So you'll have to click the lab selection. All right, we have our bunny. We got to add a mate in order for offspring to be produced. And we're going to let them produce some offspring. And now we're going to say maybe a mutation has introduced a new phenotype, being the fur phenotype. So now we start to see white and brown bunnies. A lot of bunnies. So we're going to add in a predator. And we're going to watch what happens over time here.
Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god! I have mostly brown bunnies left. I think yours is wrong.
You can play around with it. You can look at pedigrees. One of the questions was what would happen if you changed the environment. You can do that up on the top. Now I'm going to say it's winter. Click the snowflake.
really nice though. No more food, guys.
You could play around with adding limited food, or the food is really tough.
Oh no, I have 2 bunnies left.
I have 2 buddies.
Let's add in limited food here. See what happens.
Yeah, it takes over the world.
I have 2 rabbits. Jesus, they help a lot of children. There's gonna be a lot of everything.
Has anybody gotten to a point where bunnies have taken over the world?
I have, but then I added all the
Bond right there.
tangents and all of the.
Oh, yeah.
And now I'm gonna change the weather. And there's more brown They're all dead, guys. I figured out that.
I'm gonna take away limited food and see if we can't make bunnies overpopulate the world.
There's 1 rabbit left. I gotta get rid of everything.
Okay, we've got 3 generations.
There's a singular. Dog, there's a singular.
All right, so what do we see? What is doing the selecting here? The wolves, yeah, the predators in the environment. So how does the environment influence whether or not they get predated upon? Yeah, their fur color, how well they blend into their environment. Right, so the darker furred bunnies do really well in the darker furred environment. Right, in a snowy environment, white furred bunnies do well. Right, it's that environment acting upon a phenotype that is being shown by these individuals. I think this is a fun simulation. Feel free to play around with it a little bit more in your own time here. All right, so if natural selection is occurring, right, we're acting upon a phenotype. We're having a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. We can start to see 4 different patterns that could potentially arise in a population. Right, and we're going to talk about these 4 patterns: directional selection, stabilizing, diversifying, and balancing. So I'm going to move on and talk about the first one right away here. Directional selection. This is where if we start out with a population, right, it has a wide variety of phenotypes, right, that it can exhibit. One of the extremes of that phenotype is going to be favored over the other, right? So if we look at an example of mice, all right, we are starting out with a population of mice, right? They live in this dimly lit forest. They mostly have this white fur here, right? All of a sudden, a new allele has been introduced to this population, an allele that causes this brown fur, right? Maybe a new individual migrated into this population. Maybe this is a mutation that occurred, right? But now after many generations, this population is going to evolve or change in its allele frequency to have mostly darker coated mice, right? They live in a dimly lit forest. This makes sense. This is better for their camouflage, right? So if we see where we started out with, right? We started out with a variety of fur colors, more light than dark, right? Over many generations, we see that this population shifted towards one extreme, towards just the dark fur, right? So this population has gone under directional selection. It has favored one of the extreme phenotypes, right? You don't do very well if you have the lighter phenotype, right? Or if you have any of those phenotypes in between, right? But the darker phenotypes does really, really well. All right, so that would be directional selection. We can also have stabilizing selection. So this is where we are not favoring an extreme, right? Instead, if we have a range of phenotypes, we are favoring the phenotypes that are the in-between, the intermediate phenotypes, right? So an example of this would be if we think about birds and their clutch size, right? So how many eggs they produce in their nest, right? if we start out with a population that produces a wide variety of eggs, right? There's some that produce few, there are some that produce many eggs, right? Over many generations, we might see that now the population of birds typically only produces the amount of eggs, the number of eggs that are intermediate. Not too many, not too few, right? And this is on purpose. This is because the environment is doing the selecting, right? Too many eggs, and the parents cannot provide for those offspring, right? Whether it's food or care. Too few eggs, right? And we're not producing enough offspring to contribute to the next generation, right? We don't have overpopulation or more offspring being produced that can survive, right? So this intermediate is favored for this particular trait, right? So if we're looking at a graph, we might see this nice bell shape, that's this dotted line here, right? And over time, it might favor the middle phenotypes. All right, so directional selection, we're favoring one extreme. Stabilizing selection, we're favoring neither extremes, but rather the intermediate phenotype. Disruptive selection, now we're not favoring the intermediate phenotype, but rather favoring the extremes, and both of the extremes this time, not just one, right? So if we, again, we're gonna look at an example here, right? This likely occurs in an environment that has heterogeneity, meaning there's like pockets of differences within the environment. So we're gonna look at an example where those pockets of differences exist in the soil type, right? So maybe this area had some sort of a mining operation, right? Had a lot of toxic metal, high metal concentrations of waste, right? It contaminated some of the soil, right? So we have a patch of contaminated soil next to some normal soil, next to a patch of contaminated soil, next to some normal soil, right? It's really spread about in this environment, right? If we think about an example of disruptive selection, right? This colonial bentgrass is a really good example, right? Most plants cannot survive in soils that have a lot of heavy metals, right? They will die. This colonial bentgrass, however, can survive, right? It does really well in contaminated soil, right? It also does really well on uncontaminated soil, right? But if it has a soil that's just slightly contaminated, right, it doesn't do well. It doesn't do well with the middle, right? So it does really well at being metal sensitive, right? Growing where there's no metals. It does really well growing where there are metals, right? But if there's a mixture, it's not good at doing both at the same time, right? So it can only do one or the other. It can't tolerate both conditions at the same time, which leads to the separation of the extremes, right? Now it's an either or situation, right? Either it's going to tolerate it or it's not. It's not going to live in the in-between though. All right, so this is an example of disruptive selection, also known as diversifying. There's two different terms. They mean the same thing. And the last pattern we could see emerging is really a pattern where it stays the same. Right? This would be balancing selection. This is where we're just simply maintaining the genetic diversity that is already there. Right? We don't see a shift to favor one phenotype over the other. We don't see a shift to favor the intermediate phenotype. Rather, it's staying the same. Right? And there are some common ways that this can happen. Right? One way might be for a single gene. Right? Maybe the heterozygote is favored. So if we think about malaria and sickle cell disease, individuals that are carriers for sickle cell disease but do not exhibit sickle cell disease are actually quite resistant to malaria. They do better with malaria, right? Having one of each allele. However, if you have sickle cell disease, right, so you have two alleles for sickle cell disease, right, you're not going to fare so well with malaria, you're going to have sickle cell disease, that's not so advantageous. If you are on the opposite side of the spectrum, where you don't have any alleles for sickle cell disease, right, You're not going to have sickle cell disease, which is great, but you're also not going to be resistant to malaria. So those individuals who have an allele for both actually do better in regions where malaria is very prominent, right? They have what's called a heterozygote advantage, right? It is better to be a heterozygote here than being homozygous recessive or homozygous dominant. We often see this pattern where, like, common individuals tend to have a lower fitness. So if you don't exhibit a disease, for example, you have the lower fitness in these areas than if you were to have like the rare allele for those diseases. Like that's going to be favored. Right, but big picture, genetic diversity is staying the same. All right, so let's apply these situations. I've given you two graphs here, and there are arrows on both of those graphs showing which way the population is moving. And I want you to tell me what type or what pattern of natural selection is occurring.
The body size is between. Stabilizers? Yeah. That's the one.
I didn't realize there was direction. I don't know. Yeah, that'd be all right, I've given you two different graphs up here. Let's look at this first graph, right? It's a distribution of body sizes within the species of bird. And we see that over time, there's a range of body sizes, but it starts to favor a larger body size. What type of selection is happening? Directional. Yeah, we're moving in a direction. We're favoring one of the extremes. This would be a great example of directional selection. All right, my other example here, we're looking at the birth weight of babies, right? And we know there can be a wide distribution, but we also see that we tend to favor the birth weight that is in the middle, right? What type of selection is this? Stabilizing. Yeah, we're favoring the intermediate. All right. Any questions? All right, let's talk about another form of natural selection. Like I said, there's so much to talk about natural selection. So we're going to talk about sexual selection, right? So this is where individuals with certain traits are more likely to mate and reproduce with another individual. Right? We could spend a whole unit on sexual selection. If you end up taking like an animal behavior class here at Miss Davis, we'll probably will spend a whole unit talking about sexual selection. We're just gonna skim the surface here. All right, so sexual selection, there's often a few different types, right? We can have male-to-male competition, right? So we see these two crabs fighting with each other in order to get the mate. Or it might be female's choice. So here we see the plumage of this peacock trying to get the female to choose that male, right? A lot of times with sexual selection, we see these traits that are selected for more prominent in males than females in the animal kingdom. Now, sometimes those roles are reversed, right? But we tend to see the more colorful plumage, for example, or competition between each other being between males rather than between females. Right, if we're thinking about sexual selection, right, there are two different categories that it can fall into. Right? Either mating is random or it is non-random. Right? So let's talk about non-random mating first, because that is by far much more common in the animal kingdom. So non-random mating is not random, right? We have a choice. They have a choice. They're going to select according to specific traits. They might select an individual that has traits similar to it, right? That would be a sort of mating. Right? So in this example here, we have two brown beetles. They have selected to mate with one another because they look the same. They exhibit the same phenotype, right? And thus they're going to have brown offspring. Right? We're going to see this when we talk about inbreeding a little bit more. But when this happens, right, typically the populations are going to shift from having equal distributions of alleles, now shifting towards where we only have one allele. Right? We're going to lose the heterozygote, and we're going to gain mostly homozygous individuals. Right? The contrast to that is this sort of breeding. Right? So individuals are choosing other individuals that don't look like each other. Right? In this case, this brown beetle is choosing this lighter colored beetle. Right? And thereby, both of the alleles are passed on. In this instance, we're typically going to keep both alleles in the population. We're going to see many more heterozygotes, or a ratio of heterozygotes to homozygotes. All right, so we're choosing our mates based on how they look, based on the phenotype exhibited. Another method of non-random mating is inbreeding. Right? So this is where individuals that are genetically related breed with one another. Right? What we tend to see in inbreeding is that over many generations, we tend to lose individuals that are heterozygotes. Right? Instead, it favors individuals that are either homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. Right? So we're losing the heterozygote advantage. Right? So really it doesn't favor any particular allele. It just kind of decreases that heterozygote advantage in a population. Right? It decreases the ability of individuals to, say, be carriers, right? Instead of just fully exhibiting or fully not exhibiting a trait. So if we look at an example of this, right? There's a population of panthers in Florida, right? And it's a very small population. And so studies were done on these panthers. Over time, they looked at the percent survivorship of offspring, right, over different ages of these panthers. And what they found is in this population, where Florida panthers reproduced with other Florida panthers, right, it's a small population, right, we start to see a decline in survivorship, right? So we're starting to see some disadvantages being associated with inbreeding here. Now what these researchers did was they actually took some panthers from Texas, introduced it into the Florida population. So we're introducing new alleles, introducing some genetic diversity, and after time, they saw that the survivorship actually increased. It did a lot better, right? Because we had introduced some more alleles. We started to get that heterozygote advantage where we had diversity of alleles present rather than just being a homozygous individual. All right, so inbreeding can have these negative consequences, especially if the alleles being inherited have some type of mutation that is detrimental to a population. All right, so like I said, non-random mating, where mates are chosen by the males and the females, super common in the animal kingdom. But there's also a way for mating to occur that is random, right? Now this is much less prevalent, much less common, right? This typically only happens if you cannot detect who you are mating with, right? So you're equally likely to mate with any other individual within that population. So a couple examples, right? Fish some fish spawn, so they release their gametes into the water, right? And so when we have a group of fish, maybe like 100, a couple of hundred of fish spawning at the same time, they're all releasing their gametes, the egg and the sperm, in hopes that they will connect and fertilize and grow a new individual, right? But they don't know whose gametes they're being fertilized with, right? They don't know who they're mating with. It's kind of a random chance, right? Same with plants, right? Plants can a lot of times exhibit non-random mating, random mating, right? Pollinators will visit the plants, right? That plant is not telling the pollinator who they want to mate with, right? Rather, that pollinator is going to fly away and find the next flower of that same species and drop its pollen, right? It's pretty random. That plant does not know who it's going to be mated with, right? All right, so a review. I've given you 2 scenarios, and I want you to answer the questions associated with those scenarios.
This is sort of this is the first one. You're assuming that if you, okay, I don't know how to. Yeah, but it releases into the water. What? The water is taking that shit and store it, and the cow does not know where it's going. Are you guys the product of at any point? Not that I know of. Although it is very sad.
Yeah, well, you're talking about the game.
You know, that's pretty bad.
I like reading but I didn't show my images. But
it is John's. Oh, but they were questioned very severely what they were talking about. Yeah, which is weird because mine worked and they were wrong. Oh, yeah. And then they had like 6 kids.
all right, we have 2 mating pairs of frogs up here. Which pair is going to show this assortative mating? The ones that are the same or the ones that are different? Yeah, the ones that are different. Right? So disassortive starts with a D. They are different. That starts with a D. That's how you can remember that. All right, I've given you an example of these coral polyps. Right? Coral, they do not have eyes. Right? They mate by releasing their sperm and egg into the water. Right? Is this an example of random or non-random mating? Random, yeah. They don't know who they're mating with. They just hope that they can produce offspring. All right, we've talked a lot about natural selection, so we're going to move on to some of these other mechanisms of evolution. All right, so natural selection, big picture, environment is doing the selecting. So let's move on to genetic drift. All right, so genetic drift is where we have a change in allele frequencies due to random chance. Right? The environment is not doing the selecting. Right? It's unrelated to fitness. It's purely a random chance event that has occurred that has changed the proportion of alleles in the population. Right, now with genetic drift, we often see this occurring in small populations. So if we look at this graph on the screen, right, there's 2 red lines and a blue line in the middle. Right, the red line towards the top and the red line towards the bottom, right? These are both populations of mice that only have 10 individuals. So a really small population size. And we can see that over time, purely by chance, right, the frequency of this capital B allele is either going to be more prominent, right, have a higher frequency, so now we have individuals that only have capital B, or it might lose the frequency of the capital B altogether, and we might only have individuals with lowercase b, right? So that genotype will infer this phenotype of either having dark fur or light fur, right? And again, this is happening over many generations. This graph is showing 50 different generations. But if we look at this middle line, right, this is a population of 1,000 mice. And we can see fluctuations in the percentage of that capital B allele, right? It fluctuates a little bit, but it pretty much stays the same, all right? We're not losing that allele, right? We're not only having that allele, right? We still have both alleles in our population, right? So genetic drift really happens in small populations, right? The smaller the population, typically the faster this can occur. All right, so let's talk about these random events. What do I mean by random events? All right, so there's two types of events that we will talk about that are random, either a bottleneck or a founder effect. This image on the screen is an example of a random event, right? You're walking along a sidewalk and you happen to squish some bugs, and the bugs that you happen to squish are mostly green in that population, right? So you're killing off some of those green individuals purely by chance. All right, so let's look at the bottleneck effect first. So a bottleneck effect is when a population is dramatically reduced in size, again, due to a random event, right? Once it's reduced in size, it's probably lost some of the variation, and that smaller size population will then rebound, but have less genetic diversity. So if we look at this example, we have some frogs in a pond, right? We have yellow frogs, we have green frogs, we have yellow frogs that have stripes, right? A random chance event has occurred, right? There's a drought in the region. This pond has shrunk and just so happened to kill off all of the frogs that were green, right? They just happen to be the unlucky ones, right? Now there are some frogs that were yellow and yellow with stripes that died as well, right? But there are still some that survived, right? So we dramatically reduce the size of this population, right? Now it's going to rain, that pond is going to fill back in, this population can rebound, right? But that rebounded population we see is missing the phenotype of being green, right? This is a really great example of a bottleneck effect. We have a population, it's dramatically changed in size, and then it rebounds, right? So if we look at it, the surviving members have allele frequencies different than the original population, and this new population likely has less genetic variation. And we see that with our frogs, right? We have lost that phenotype of being green. Don't want to move on too fast. I know there's a lot of text on this slide. So we have this bottleneck population, random occurrence. Maybe if you're a developer and you're developing a habitat into houses, maybe you just happen to develop the parcel of land that contains the red flowers. Now the remaining flowers will lose that red phenotype. All right, so bottleneck effect is one way we can get genetic drift. Another way is through this founder effect. All right, so the founder effect, now the original population is not going to dramatically reduce. That original population is going to stay. Rather, a subset of individuals from that population are going to start a new population. They're going to start a new colony. All right, so in this example, we have a population of butterflies. Right? That population is not going to dramatically decline. It stays the same. But rather, a subset of these butterflies, right? Maybe they've migrated to a new island. Maybe they got caught by a wind draft that pulled them to this new island. Whatever it may be, a subset of these individuals started a new colony. And it just so happened that that subset of individuals did not include this white allele, right? So now when this new colony starts to grow in size, this new colony is going to have butterflies that lack the white allele, right? So again, there's less genetic variation in the founding colony than the original colony. Right? There's some examples in human populations of this founder effect. So if we think about the Amish population, I believe this is an Amish community in Pennsylvania, right? A subset of these individuals decided to, settle in a new area, right? And when they settled in a new area, it just so happened that the individuals that migrated out had this trait for polydactyly, where you have more than 5 fingers on your hand, right? Because it had that trait in that population, it just so happened that that population now has a higher occurrence of polydactyly, right? So it changed the allele frequency of polydactyly in that colony that was that settled in the new area versus the original population, right? And we can see that here, a subset of the population left, so just a slice of this pie decided to migrate away, right? Founded a new population, and this polydactyly became more prominent. We changed the allele frequencies. All right, I've given you 2 scenarios, and I want you to answer the question, is it genetic drift? And if it is, what type of genetic drift?
It's just
I don't know, that's my sister. No, I see right that's like
I finished.
I finally got my heat working in my truck, so now everywhere else is cold.
Your heat has a more. My heat's working so well. Unless it's my live's just too buttery in my state, so I think calling it bubble back is better.
I feel like last call. Yeah.
Favorite class?
Do you know anything about the island? Oh my gosh, why can't I remember what it's called?
Where is it located? Okay.
That's my favorite glass bottle.
I'm trying to remember what it's called. Oh my gosh. But they're isolated completely on their own island. I can't remember. I literally had it in my brain and I just lost it as you walked over. I'll get it.
Do they have a certain trait that's more prominent?
Well, I don't know if it's illegal to visit there because they don't have a language. Like they don't have a language everybody knows. So like I wonder. That's my biggest thing is I like seeing stuff about it.
Yeah.
And it's like a completely isolated like inbreed because like nobody knew it was coming to the island. So it's just like primarily that, and they're like dying off now because like they can't like they don't have any variation to keep them going. But they've been around for like 1,200 years, but they've just been on that island, so it's been a long.
Something I was told.
I know. It's like, what do you do? But it's like,
Yeah.
but they kill everybody that tries to like go to their island because they're all, yeah. And I need to figure out what it's called now so we can do that.
It's a certain tribe.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, we have a scenario of these frogs.
If they're
Predator of these frogs, like the darker skinned frogs. So over time, this population evolves to have only light skinned frogs. Oh, is this an example of genetic drift? I heard it, I see some shaking of heads. No, it is not. What is an example of? Natural selection, yeah, this is actually an example of directional selection, right? It's favoring one phenotype. All right, this next scenario is an example of genetic drift, right? And we're looking at northern elephant seals. This population was massively reduced to only 20 individuals.
Yeah.
And just from these 20 individuals, we now have 30,000 individuals. Right? Is this a bottleneck or a founder effect? It is a bottleneck. Yes. Does that population dramatically reduce? All right. Any questions about genetic drift? All right, let's move on to our last two mechanisms of evolution then. Right? We have gene flow as the next mechanism that we are going to talk about here. Right? So if we're talking about gene flow, we're talking about two populations, at least two populations. And we're thinking about how migration can happen between the two populations. Right? So, in this example, we're looking at two populations that have different allele frequencies. All right, population 1 has a higher allele frequency of this lighter fur color on the deer, which is resembled by those red dots. Population 2 has the darker fur, right, denoted by these blue dots. Right? So these populations were separated from each other. Right? Because remember, a population is a subset of species in a particular geographic area that can interact with each other. Right? They were separated. They're different populations, and they were separated by this mountain range. Right? Now these populations have discovered that there is a pass that allows them to move between the mountain range. Right? So now some individuals from each population are migrating into the opposite population. Right? So when that happens, we get a population of mostly dark-furred deer now having the introduction of some light-furred deer. Right? We're changing the allele frequencies. We're actually increasing genetic diversity. Right? We're adding in new genetic diversity that wasn't in this population previously. Right? Same for the other population. We're adding in that genetic diversity of having darker fur. All right, so we have two populations. Migration is happening between them. We're actually increasing genetic diversity in this scenario. Yeah?
In real life, what would motivate them to do this migration?
What would motivate them? Yeah, it could be different environments. Maybe the other population has better access to food, and so some of them are migrating out. Maybe it's like a territorial type of thing, where it's a type of animal that will separate from the herd or the pack and start a new colony, and they happen to run into another population. Yeah, there could be a variety of like influences there. Yeah. All right, just another example to reiterate this point here. Right? If we have two populations, right? So we're looking at these pie charts up here, right? These two populations have different ratios of their alleles, right? One of these populations have mostly what we're going to call the blue allele here, whereas the other side has a greater proportion of the green to the blue allele. If migration occurs, right, we're actually changing the frequency in not just one population, but both of them at the same time. Right? So another example, right, we have this population here. It's created a homozygous population where they have capital H, capital H. On the other side of the mountain, there's a population of this bird, also created a homozygous population of lowercase h, lowercase h. Right? These populations meet, right? Maybe they find a portion of the mountain where they can interact with each other. Right? And now we see the introduction of the lowercase h into the homozygous dominant population. right? As well as the introduction of the capital H into the homozygous recessive population. We're increasing genetic diversity. All right, we're going to move on to our last mechanism of evolution here, and that is mutations. Right, we've kind of already alluded to mutations can cause differences in the allele frequencies when we did our rabbit simulation here, right? So mutations, when they occur in the population, again, they are random. It's not like the mouse or any other organism you're looking at has decided it needs to mutate, right? It just happens to have a random mutation. Because of that mutation, we can introduce new phenotypes into the population, and thus we can increase genetic diversity with mutations. Right, so here we have a population of mice. Their underlying genotype that allows them to have this dark fur is GGG, so 3 guanosines here. If all of a sudden in this population, a mouse was born that had a mutation, right? It changed the underlying DNA from GGG to GGC. And that happened to change its fur color to be white. Right? So now as time goes on, we might have a population that now has brown and white individuals. We've changed that allele frequency in a population over time. Right, now this mutation, it could be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing. Right? If this mutation occurs, now maybe natural selection can be another mechanism of evolution that can happen in this population. So if this mutation occurred in an environment that was dark, right, this white-furred individual is going to stick out more. This is probably not going to be a good mutation. Right? But if that mutation occurred in an environment that was lighter colored, maybe it's a snowy environment, this is going to be a very good mutation. Right? So again, it's completely by chance. Right? And once that mutation occurs, we've increased the genetic diversity, and now other forces of evolution can start to act upon the phenotype because of this mutation. All right, let's review our 4 mechanisms of evolution here. So I want you to tell me, for each mechanism of evolution, is it going to increase or decrease the genetic diversity over time? Does natural selection always?
No.
Oh, why do we say that? What type of selection could occur that doesn't change? Oh, thank you, Alan. Okay.
The question is which after genetic drift all around, so genetic flow
The big lion
yeah, like it's
eating out the lid.
That's not that
Is it your favorite?
When I was growing up, that was my favorite. Yes. I like the original line.
Yeah, the new one was pretty good.
It was weird. It was weird that the emotion in the animal's faces.
Well, migration increases genetic. It's almost like if you're seeing genetic.
Yeah.
What's the difference between genetic drift and genetic flow? What happens when I pick up a 1030 and miss most of the clones?
Genetic drift is where there's a random event that basically decreases the size of a population and deletes out some of the variation. Where genetic flow is where we have two populations that can intermingle.
Oh, okay. I say mother.
Yes. That's like the best way I can put it in like 30 seconds.
Then what's the difference between migration and genetic flow? Okay, I did understand.
Migration is like the mechanism by which genetic flow works.
Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
All right, we have 4 different mechanisms of evolution occurring here. Is it going to increase or decrease genetic diversity? We're going to do thumbs up for increase, thumbs down for decrease. Natural selection, increase or decrease? Did anybody say increase? Anybody say it's not going to do anything? Natural selection is a tricky one. Most of the time it's going to decrease, right? But there's that pattern of balancing selection that actually just maintains the genetic diversity. It doesn't really do anything with it. Yeah. What about genetic drift? Increase or decrease? Decrease. Gene flow? Increase. And mutations? Increase. Yes. All right. Any questions about these? All right. Well, our next part of this unit, we're going to be doing some calculations on how to determine the percentage of alleles within a population. But we're going to save that for Tuesday. We're going to have an early end today, all right? Because if we start on that topic, we're not going to remember it on Tuesday. So enjoy your extra time. Keep in mind, content check 9 is due. That will be up later today.
I have a question.
Yes.
Will the genetic drift be like